The fire that ruled an empire. Welcome to Relics of Time. Before we begin, if you love ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, forgotten gods, and the hidden stories buried beneath the dust of history, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which ancient empire fascinates you the most. Because tonight, we are traveling into the heart of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. A civilization of kings and conquerors. Of vast deserts and mountain fortresses. Of gold, stone, fire, and silence. A civilization whose armies shook continents, whose rulers called themselves kings of kings, whose banners stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of India. And at the center of that world, there was not only power, there was belief, there was faith. There was a sacred flame that did not merely burn in temples, but in the very soul of an empire. Tonight, we enter the spiritual world of ancient Persia. We will uncover the religion that shaped the mighty Persian Empire, the faith that stood behind its rulers, the moral vision that divided the universe into truth and lies, light and darkness, order and chaos. And above it all, we will meet the great divine figure at the center of that faith. The god many consider one of the most important and influential deities in all of ancient religious history. A name that echoed through royal courts, across mountain sanctuaries, through sacred hymns, and into the minds of emperors. Ahura Mazda. But this is not merely the story of a god. This is the story of a worldview. A way of seeing the universe, not as random, not as meaningless, but as a battlefield. A battlefield where every thought matters. Every word matters. Every action matters. A battlefield where human beings are not passive observers, but participants in a cosmic struggle. And if that sounds strangely familiar, if it sounds like an idea that would echo through later religions, later empires, later moral systems, that is because the religion of ancient Persia may have shaped far more of human history than most people realize. Its ideas would outlive kings, outlive palaces, outlive invasions, outlive fire itself. To understand Persia, you cannot begin only with armies. You cannot begin only with Cyrus the Great, or Darius, or Xerxes. You must begin deeper. In the realm of spirit. In the realm of symbol. In the realm of ancient revelation. Because behind the stone reliefs of Persepolis, behind the grand processions of tribute bearers, behind the crowns and the royal inscriptions, there was a deeper order. The Persians did not simply rule land. They believed they were defending truth, and that changes everything. When most people think of ancient empires, they imagine soldiers, taxes, roads, monuments, battles. But the greatest empires are not held together by force alone. They are held together by meaning. A civilization can survive war. It can survive famine. It can survive dynastic struggle. But if it loses its sense of meaning, its soul begins to crack. The Persians understood this. Their kings did not see themselves as mere rulers. They saw themselves as guardians of order, protectors of divine balance, defenders of a cosmic truth that had to be upheld not only on the battlefield, but in the laws of the empire, the conduct of the court, the rituals of worship, and the moral lives of ordinary people. This was not religion in the modern sense alone. It was not simply private belief. It was civilization itself. And that is why the story we are about to enter is so powerful. Because in ancient Persia, faith was not pushed to the margins of life. It stood at the center. It stood beside the throne. It stood in the fire temple. It stood in the oath of the noble. It stood in the judgment of the king. It stood in the idea that the world was not morally neutral, that some things were true, and some things were false, that some forces created life, and some forces corrupted it, that the human soul had a role to play. This vision did not emerge overnight. Like all great spiritual traditions, it grew from older roots. Long before the Persian Empire became the superpower of its age, before its roads connected nations, before its armies crossed deserts and mountains, before Greek historians wrote in awe and fear of its grandeur, there were Iranian peoples, tribes and communities living across the great plateaus and steppes of the ancient Iranian world. They were part of a wider Indo-Iranian heritage. They carried old traditions, old gods, old rituals. They honored powers of nature. They spoke sacred words. They knew sacrifice, fire, the sky, the moral weight of oath and loyalty. Their world was ancient, and already full of symbols. But at some point, in the distant past, something changed. Or rather, someone changed everything. A figure emerged from the haze of antiquity. A man who would become one of the most mysterious and consequential religious voices of the ancient world. A prophet. A reformer. A visionary. A man whose name would survive for thousands of years. Zarathustra, also known in Greek form as Zoroaster. Even today, historians debate exactly when he lived. Some place him many centuries before the great Persian kings, others place him later. The exact date remains uncertain, and perhaps that uncertainty makes him even more haunting, because Zarathustra stands at the edge of history and myth, not fully visible, not fully lost, like a figure seen through desert heat, real yet distant. But whether he lived earlier or later than some scholars believe, his message became one of the most important spiritual turning points in the ancient world. According to tradition, Zarathustra experienced a revelation. A divine encounter. He came to proclaim that above all other beings stood a supreme wise lord, Ahura Mazda. The name itself is often translated as something like Wise Lord, and that title alone tells us something profound. This was not merely a storm god, not merely a tribal deity of war, not merely a local patron spirit. This was a god of wisdom, of truth, of cosmic order, of moral law, a divine intelligence behind existence itself. In Zarathustra's vision, the world was not simply filled with many competing divine personalities the way older polytheistic systems often imagined. Instead, reality had a deeper moral architecture. There was truth, and there was the lie. There was order, and there was destructive chaos. There was the path aligned with Ahura Mazda, and there was the path of opposition. This is one of the reasons why the religion associated with Zarathustra feels so strikingly advanced, even startlingly modern in some of its moral structure, because it places ethical choice at the center of existence. Not just ritual, not just bloodline, not just tribe. Choice. To think rightly. To speak rightly. To act rightly. This triad would become one of the most famous moral formulas associated with the tradition: good thoughts, good words, good deeds, simple, elegant, powerful. If the Persian world was built upon faith, then that faith was not built on comfort. It was built on conflict. Not merely the clash of armies, not merely the rise and fall of kings, not merely the violence of conquest or the pride of empire. No. At the deepest level of ancient Persian belief, the universe itself was a battlefield. A vast and invisible struggle was unfolding behind the visible world. Every sunrise, every oath, every act of justice, every betrayal, every honest word, every lie, all of it mattered, because nothing was neutral. To the religious imagination shaped by Zarathustra, the cosmos was not simply a place where events happened. It was a moral arena. And at the center of that arena stood the great divine force we have already named, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. But what did that truly mean? To modern ears, the title may sound serene, wise, noble, majestic, and yes, there is serenity in the name. But there is also something else: responsibility. Because Ahura Mazda was not merely a distant creator sitting beyond the stars, indifferent to human life. He was the source of truth, the source of order, the source of justice, the source of rightness in a world where wrongness was painfully real. He was not simply powerful. He was morally perfect. And that distinction is crucial. In many ancient religions, the gods are powerful, but flawed. They can be jealous, petty, lustful, deceptive, or cruel. They often reflect the chaos of human nature magnified into the heavens. But the Persian religious vision moved in a different direction. Ahura Mazda was not merely stronger than other divine beings. He represented something higher. He was aligned with what was true, with what was pure, with what was ordered, with what was good. This is where we encounter one of the most important concepts in all of Zoroastrian thought, Asha. If there is one word, one sacred principle, you must understand to grasp the Persian spiritual worldview, it is this. Asha. It is difficult to translate with perfect precision, because like many ancient sacred terms, it carries layers of meaning. It can mean truth, order, rightness, cosmic harmony, the proper pattern of existence. Asha is not just honesty in the narrow sense. It is not simply telling the truth. It is the structure of reality when reality is aligned correctly. It is the way the world is supposed to be, the rhythm by which stars move, the fairness by which justice is judged, the integrity by which a promise is kept, the purity by which ritual is maintained, the moral alignment by which a person chooses what is right. Asha is both cosmic and personal. It belongs to the universe, and it belongs to the soul. And if Asha is the true order of existence, then what opposes it? The answer is another word. Dark, powerful, and deeply feared. Druj, often translated as the lie. But again, that translation, while correct, can sound too small in modern ears. Druj is not merely a false statement. It is deception as a cosmic principle. It is corruption, distortion, disorder, spiritual pollution, the unraveling of what should be whole. If Asha is truth woven into the structure of reality, Druj is the tearing of that fabric. This is why lying was not merely rude or immoral in ancient Persian religious thought. It could be profoundly serious. Because a lie was not just a social offense. It was participation in disorder. A betrayal of the moral architecture of the world. Think about how extraordinary that is. An empire that treated truth not only as an ethical virtue, but as a cosmic obligation. An empire whose rulers would repeatedly frame rebellion and treachery not simply as political crimes, but as manifestations of falsehood. Suddenly, Persian royal inscriptions make much more sense. When kings spoke of punishing the lie, they were not only using propaganda. They were speaking from within a sacred worldview. A worldview in which power had to justify itself through alignment with truth. At least in theory. And yes, history is always messier than ideology. Empires often fail their own ideals. Kings who claim righteousness are not always righteous. States that speak of order can still commit cruelty. But that tension itself tells us something important. It tells us the ideal existed. And ideals matter, because they shape how power explains itself. In the Persian case, power did not simply say, "I rule because I am stronger." It often said, "I rule because I stand with truth." That is a very different kind of imperial self-image. But if there is truth, and if there is the lie, then who or what stands behind the lie? This brings us to one of the most debated and fascinating elements of Zoroastrian thought, the figure, or force, known as Ahura Mazda. In later tradition, often identified with the name Ahriman. If Ahura Mazda is the wise lord, the source of truth, light, and order, then Ahura Mazda is the destructive spirit, the adversarial principle, the force of hostility, corruption, and ruin. Now, here we must tread carefully. Because Zoroastrian theology developed over time, and scholars still debate exactly how early formulations should be understood. Was the religion strictly monotheistic in the modern sense? Was it dualistic? Did Ahura Mazda create everything, including the possibility of evil, or were good and evil presented as two opposed spiritual realities? The answer depends on period, text, interpretation, and historical context. But for the purposes of understanding the emotional and philosophical core of the religion, one thing is clear: ancient Persian religious thought gave enormous weight to the reality of moral opposition. Evil was not merely illusion. It was not trivial. It was not something brushed aside. It was active. It was dangerous. It corrupted creation. It twisted life toward decay, disease, violence, impurity, and falsehood. And humanity was caught in the middle. This is what makes Zoroastrianism feel so powerful even today. It takes the experience of the human condition seriously. Because what do we actually see in life? We see beauty, and cruelty. We see truth, and manipulation. We see courage, and cowardice. We see order, and collapse. We see love, and destruction. Ancient Persian religion looked at that reality and said this tension is not accidental. It is built into the drama of existence. But unlike some systems that sink into fatalism, Zoroastrian thought does something remarkable. It gives the human being agency. You are not just trapped in the struggle, you matter within it. Your thoughts matter, your words matter, your deeds matter. Every moral act becomes a small victory or a small surrender. Every truthful word supports Asha. Every lie strengthens Druj. Every act of justice participates in cosmic repair. Every act of cruelty feeds corruption. Imagine living in a world where daily ethics were charged with that level of spiritual significance, where your inner life was not private noise, but part of the universe's ongoing war. This is why Zoroastrianism is often remembered, not only as an ancient religion, but as one of the earliest great moral religions, not because older cultures lacked morality, far from it, but because here, morality becomes central to cosmic structure in an especially clear and dramatic way. And that drama did not end with individual conduct. It extended into spiritual beings, because Ahura Mazda was not imagined as alone in a simplistic sense. Around the divine order, there were sacred emanations or exalted beings often known as the Ain Shah Spentas. Their name is often rendered as something like bounteous immortals. These were not simply gods, in the old polytheistic sense, nor are they easy to fit neatly into modern categories. Some scholars compare them, loosely, to archangelic or divine aspects, manifestations of sacred qualities associated with Ahura Mazda and the structure of creation. Each is linked to a particular moral or cosmic principle: truth, devotion, wholeness, immortality, good mind, right dominion. They form part of the spiritual architecture of a universe that is not random, but ordered, layered, meaningful, alive with sacred significance. And this matters because it shows us that Persian religion was not merely a stark abstract philosophy. It was spiritually populated. It had texture. It had liturgy. It had symbolism. It had hierarchy. It had invisible presences woven into the structure of reality. There were also other divine beings or worthy ones, later often called Jazatas, who received reverence within the broader framework of the religion. Again, this reminds us that the Persian religious world was not always simple to classify. It had monotheistic tendencies of great power. It had dualistic features of profound intensity. It retained older Indo-Iranian layers. It developed over centuries. And yet, through all of that complexity, the central heartbeat remained astonishingly clear: the world matters, truth matters, choice matters. That is why the religion of ancient Persia could be both deeply spiritual and deeply political. Because if truth is sacred, then law matters. If order is sacred, then kingship matters. If purity is sacred, then ritual matters. If the lie is dangerous, then rebellion, treachery, and corruption are not merely inconvenient, they are existential threats. This worldview gave Persian civilization a moral grammar, and once you see that grammar, you begin to understand why their sacred symbol became so iconic: fire, the flame, the ever-burning light. To outsiders, it was easy to misunderstand. Some ancient observers assumed Persians worshipped fire. But that is too simplistic, and deeply misleading. The fire itself was not the ultimate god. The fire was a symbol, a living, visible sign of purity, truth, illumination, and divine presence. It was not an idol in the crude sense. It was a sacred focus. A reminder. A visible form of invisible reality. Fire reveals. Fire purifies. Fire consumes corruption. Fire gives light in darkness. Could there be a more fitting symbol for a religion centered on truth? The sacred flame became one of the most powerful visual expressions of Persian spirituality. Guarded, honored, maintained with care, not because Persians adored the physical element for its own sake, but because it represented something higher, something clean, something incorruptible, something aligned with Asha. And when we move deeper into Persian ritual life, into the temples, the priesthood, the handling of purity, the treatment of death, and the sacred rules surrounding contamination, we will see just how seriously that symbolism was taken. Because in ancient Persian religion, purity was not a metaphor alone. It was a discipline. A sacred responsibility. And in the next part of our journey, we will step into that world. We will enter the fire temples. We will explore the rituals, the priests, the sacred texts, and the mysteries of purity and pollution. We will confront one of the most haunting and misunderstood practices associated with Zoroastrian tradition: the treatment of the dead. Because in the religion of ancient Persia, Even death itself had to be handled carefully, lest corruption spread into the living world. And once you understand that, you begin to see that this was not merely a religion of belief. It was a religion of vigilance. A religion of discipline. A religion that asked its followers to guard the order of the world, one act at a time. If the religion of ancient Persia was built upon truth, then that truth was not meant to remain abstract. It was not meant to live only in philosophy, not only in royal inscriptions, not only in the distant realm of divine ideas. It had to be practiced, guarded, maintained, fed, almost like a flame, and nowhere was that more visible than in the sacred ritual life of the Persian world. Because for the followers of Ahura Mazda, religion was not merely something one believed. It was something one kept, something one protected from corruption, something that had to be preserved with precision, with reverence, and with constant awareness that the world could always slip toward disorder. This is why ritual purity became so central. To modern minds, the idea of purity laws can sound strange, distant, or overly formal. But in the Persian religious imagination, purity was not about obsession for its own sake. It was about cosmic responsibility. If the world is a battleground between order and corruption, between Asha and Druj, then what enters the body, the home, the temple, the land, and the sacred space matters. Matter itself matters. The physical world is not spiritually irrelevant. It can be honored. It can be defiled. It can be protected. It can be polluted. And because of that, ritual became a way of defending creation, not against foreign armies, but against invisible decay. This is the key to understanding why ancient Persian religion developed such a deep concern with fire, water, earth, bodily cleanliness, sacred speech, and the treatment of death. Because all of these things belong to the order of creation, and all of them could be endangered. Let us begin with the most iconic image of all, the sacred fire. Few images are more closely associated with ancient Persian religion than the flame, still, bright, unblinking, burning in the silence of a temple. To outsiders, especially in the ancient world, this was often misunderstood. Greek observers and later commentators sometimes reduced Persian worship to something simplistic. They worshipped fire. But that is not truly accurate. The fire was sacred, yes, revered, absolutely, protected with extraordinary care, without question. But it was not the ultimate deity itself. It was a symbol. A vessel of presence. A visible expression of what could not be easily seen. Think about what fire is. It gives light, but cannot be grasped. It purifies, but destroys impurity. It is alive in motion, yet strangely still when watched in reverence. It reveals what darkness hides. It can warm, illuminate, cleanse, and transform. In a religion centered on truth, order, and purity, what symbol could be more fitting? This is why the sacred flame stood at the heart of worship, not as an idol, but as a reminder. A visible sign of invisible order. A point of focus. A holy witness. In the temples, fire had to be tended carefully. It was not to be casually contaminated. Its maintenance required discipline, ritual knowledge, and respect. This brings us to the priesthood. In the Persian religious world, sacred knowledge mattered deeply. Words had power. Pronunciations mattered. Ritual formulas mattered. Correct performance mattered. Because if the universe itself has structure, then sacred action must reflect that structure. Priests, often referred to in many contexts as magi or members of the priestly class, played a crucial role in preserving this order. Now, the word magi is famous. It has traveled far beyond its Persian origins. It became wrapped in Greek descriptions, later legends, and even biblical tradition. But historically, it points us towards something important. Ancient Persian religion had specialists, custodians of ritual, guardians of sacred fire, preservers of liturgical memory, experts in purity, prayer, and ceremonial correctness. These were not merely religious officials, in the modern bureaucratic sense. They stood between the visible and the invisible. They maintained continuity. They remembered what others could forget. And in a tradition where corruption could enter through negligence, forgetfulness itself could become dangerous. This is one reason why sacred speech mattered so much. In many ancient religions, spoken formulas are powerful. But in the Zoroastrian tradition, sacred utterance carried special weight. Prayers were not just emotional expressions. They were acts of alignment. To speak correctly, to recite rightly, to preserve the holy words, was itself a defense of order. Because language is not neutral in a religion built around truth and the lie. Words can heal. Words can bind. Words can deceive. Words can profane. So the right word, spoken in the right way, at the right time, in the right ritual setting, was not a detail. It was sacred action. This leads us to one of the most important treasures of the tradition, the Avesta. When we speak of the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, the Avesta stands at the center. But like the religion itself, the textual history is complex. What survives today is only part of what once existed. Centuries of war, upheaval, conquest, transmission, and loss have shaped what remains. And yet, even in fragmentary form, the Avesta opens a window into one of the oldest religious worlds still remembered. Within it are hymns, prayers, liturgical formulas, ritual instructions, and sacred compositions linked to different periods of the tradition. Among the most revered portions are the Gathas, poetic hymns traditionally associated with Zarathustra himself. If that tradition is correct, then these verses may preserve some of the oldest and most intimate echoes of the prophet's own voice. That alone is extraordinary. Here, across the abyss of millennia, not just the laws of a religion, but its songs, its sacred poetry, its cry toward truth. The Gathas are not easy texts. They are ancient, difficult, layered, and often interpreted with great care. But what shines through them is unmistakable, a deep moral seriousness. A longing for alignment with truth. A struggle against falsehood. A reverence for Ahura Mazda. A vision of human life as spiritually consequential. This is not casual piety. It is existential religion. And like all living traditions, the texts were not merely read. They were embodied in ritual. They were spoken, sung, remembered, enacted. Which brings us to something deeply revealing about ancient Persian religion. It was not centered on temples in the same way some neighboring civilizations were. This may sound surprising. When people imagine ancient religion, they often picture colossal temple complexes packed with divine statues. But the Zoroastrian world was different. Yes, there were sacred spaces. Yes, there were fire temples and ritual centers. Yes, there were structures of worship and ceremonial importance. But the religion was notably resistant to simple idol-based devotion. The focus was not on bowing before a carved image of a god in the same way many other ancient systems did. This is significant, because it aligns beautifully with the deeper logic of the faith. If the divine is understood through truth, order, sacred presence, and moral reality, then symbol matters more than representation. Fire, light, recitation, purity, sacred formula. These become central not because they are decorative, but because they are fitting. They reflect the nature of the religion itself. And then we come to one of the most haunting and misunderstood aspects of all, death. Few things reveal a civilization's spiritual logic more clearly than how it treats the dead. And in the Zoroastrian tradition, death was not merely sad. It was dangerous. Not in the emotional sense alone. In the ritual sense. Why? Because death was associated with corruption, decay, the breakdown of the living order. Remember the religious framework we explored in Part 2, life aligned with Asha, corruption aligned with Druj. Once death enters the body is no longer spiritually neutral. It becomes vulnerable to contamination. This created a serious problem. How do you honor the dead without polluting the sacred elements of creation? You cannot simply bury the body in the earth, because that may contaminate the earth. You cannot simply burn it, because that may defile the sacred fire. You cannot simply cast it into water, because that may pollute the waters. And if earth, fire, and water are all part of a divinely ordered creation that must be protected, then ordinary disposal becomes a spiritual dilemma. The solution that developed is one of the most famous practices associated with Zoroastrianism. Exposure of the dead. In later and better known forms, this practice became associated with structures often called towers of silence. These elevated circular structures were designed so that corpses could be placed in the open, where the flesh would be consumed naturally, traditionally by carrion birds, without directly contaminating the sacred elements. To modern people, this can sound shocking, even disturbing. And yes, it is unsettling, but we must resist the temptation to judge too quickly through modern instinct alone, because beneath the practice lies a powerful and coherent spiritual logic. This was not neglect. It was not cruelty. It was not indifference. It was a way of navigating a profound religious problem. How do you treat the dead respectfully, while protecting the living world from ritual pollution? Seen through that lens, the practice becomes not grotesque, but deeply serious, austere, disciplined, almost tragic in its honesty. It acknowledges death not as a romantic mystery, but as a rupture. A wound in creation, something that must be handled carefully, soberly, and without corrupting what remains sacred. That same concern extended into other dimensions of life: contact with bodily fluids, impure substances, contaminated objects, improper handling of ritual materials. All of these could require purification. And purification was not always symbolic in a vague sense. It could involve real procedures, real rules, real disciplines. The Persian religious world was highly attentive to what entered the sacred sphere, attentive to what disturbed balance, attentive to the hidden consequences of negligence. To some, that may sound severe, and perhaps it was, but it also reveals something beautiful. It reveals a people who believed that creation was worth protecting, that the world was not disposable, that the elements, fire, water, earth, air, life itself, deserved reverence. And in that sense, ancient Persian religion can feel strangely modern, because beneath the ritual system lies a profound intuition: the world is fragile, and what we do to it matters. By now, we can begin to see how extraordinary this tradition truly was. It gave sacred significance to ethics. It gave cosmic meaning to truth. It gave ritual seriousness to purity. It gave symbolic power to fire. It treated the elements with reverence. It saw death as a spiritual challenge, and it preserved all of this through priests, hymns, recitations, and disciplined observance. But religion does not remain untouched when it enters the realm of kings. And in the next part of our journey, we finally step fully into the age of empire. We will meet the great rulers of Persia: Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes, and we will ask a crucial question: how did the religion of Ahura Mazda shape imperial power? Did Persian kings truly see themselves as chosen defenders of truth? How openly did they proclaim their devotion? And how did one of the largest empires in history govern countless peoples, languages, and faiths while still grounding itself in a sacred vision? Because when religion stands beside a throne, it does not stay the same, and neither does the throne. There are moments in history when belief steps out of the temple and climbs the throne, when faith is no longer hidden in ritual alone and no longer guarded only by priests, sacred fires, and whispered hymns. Instead, it speaks in the language of kings. It is carved into stone, proclaimed across mountains, etched into palaces, declared before armies. And in ancient Persia, that is exactly what happened. Because the religion of Ahura Mazda was not merely the private spirituality of mystics. It became the language of empire, the language of legitimacy, the language by which some of the most powerful rulers on earth explained who they were, why they ruled, and what gave them the right to command nations. This is where the story grows larger. And no longer only sacred, now imperial. And to understand that transformation, we must enter the age of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the greatest political creations of the ancient world. A realm so vast, so organized, and so astonishing in its scale that even its enemies had to admire it. It stretched across continents, from Anatolia and Egypt, through Mesopotamia, across the Iranian plateau, into Central Asia, and toward the frontiers of India. It ruled over many peoples, many languages, many customs, many gods, and yet somehow, this enormous and diverse empire held together, not perfectly, not forever, but long enough to leave an imprint on world history that still remains visible. And at the beginning of that imperial story stands one of the most revered rulers of Antiquity, Cyrus the Great. Even now, the name carries weight. To some, he is a conqueror. To others, a liberator. To many historians, one of the most remarkable founders of empire the ancient world ever produced. He defeated powerful rivals. He absorbed kingdoms. He built the foundation of a superpower. And yet, unlike many conquerors, his memory is often wrapped not only in fear, but in admiration. Why? Because Cyrus became associated with something rare in ancient imperial history: measured power. A ruler who conquered, but did not always humiliate. A king who expanded, but often ruled through accommodation rather than destruction. This is especially visible in one of the most famous episodes of his reign, the conquest of Babylon. When Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BC, he did not present himself simply as a foreign destroyer. Instead, in the famous Cyrus cylinder, he appears in a language of restoration, legitimacy, and divine favor, though in distinctly Babylonian terms. This is crucial, because it reveals something profound about Persian imperial religion. It was not simplistic. Cyrus did not force one narrow religious formula on every subject people. He understood power. He understood symbols. He understood that ruling a vast empire required more than swords. It required respect for local traditions. It required political intelligence. It required allowing conquered peoples to see him not merely as an invader, but as a rightful ruler. This is why the Persian Empire became famous for a certain degree of religious tolerance, at least compared to some other ancient powers, not modern tolerance in the liberal sense. Of course, we must be careful not to romanticize. Ancient empires were still empires. They taxed, controlled, punished, and sometimes crushed resistance. But within that reality, the Achaemenid Persians often governed through a remarkable degree of flexibility. Local cults could continue. Temples could function. Traditional elites could be incorporated. Regional identities were not always erased. And this matters deeply, because it means Persian imperial religion was not about destroying every other god in sight. It was about placing Persian kingship under the authority of Ahura Mazda, while still ruling a multi-religious world. That is a very sophisticated imperial model. It says, "Our king is legitimate under the highest divine order, but the empire is large enough to contain many peoples." This is one reason Cyrus remains such a powerful figure in memory. Even in the Hebrew Bible, he appears in a remarkably positive light, because he allowed exiled communities, including the Jews in Babylon, to return and rebuild. That does not mean Cyrus was modern, in the way people sometimes imagine. But it does mean his empire understood a truth many conquerors forget: lasting rule often requires restraint. Still, for all the greatness of Cyrus, the clearest direct statements linking Persian kingship to Ahura Mazda come into sharper focus under another ruler. A man of enormous ambition, enormous organizational genius, and enormous confidence in his own right to rule. Darius I. Often called Darius the Great. If Cyrus founded the empire, Darius gave it structure. He reorganized administration, strengthened the satrapal system, built roads, expanded monumental architecture, commissioned vast projects, and above all, he spoke, not just in policy, not just in war, but in stone, and nowhere is that voice more powerful than in one of the most important inscriptions in ancient history, the Behistun inscription, carved high into a cliff face in western Iran. This monument is both political declaration and sacred statement. In it, Darius tells the story of how he took power, how he defeated rebels, how he crushed false claimants, how he restored order. But notice the language. Again and again, Darius attributes his success to Ahura Mazda. Not vaguely, not casually, explicitly. He proclaims that Ahura Mazda granted him kingship, that Ahura Mazda aided him, that his victories came through divine favor, that his enemies were liars, deceivers, rebels against rightful order. This is not random royal flattery toward heaven. This is theology. Imperial theology. Darius is telling the world, I am not merely king because I won. I am king because truth is with me. This is exactly where everything we discussed in earlier parts comes together. Asha and Druj. Truth and the lie. order and falsehood. In Darius's inscriptions, political rebellion is framed not just as disobedience, but as moral spiritual corruption. The rebel is not merely a rival. He is a liar, and the king is not merely victorious. He is aligned with truth. Whether every historical detail of Darius's rise to power is as clean as he claims is another matter entirely. Historians know that royal inscriptions are not neutral. They justify, they simplify, they glorify. But that is precisely the point. What a king chooses as his justification reveals the ideals he believes, or at least wants others to believe, give him legitimacy. Darius chose Ahura Mazda. He chose truth. He chose the defeat of the lie. That tells us everything. Now imagine the psychological force of that in an empire spanning millions of people. To serve the king was not merely to serve administration. It could be framed as service to order itself. To rebel was not only political risk. It could be cast as participation in chaos. This is how empires become powerful beyond armies. They sacralize power. And yet the Persian version of this is especially fascinating because it did not usually collapse into simple fanaticism. The empire remained plural. Its subjects worshipped many gods. Egyptians remained Egyptian. Babylonians remained Babylonian. Jews returned to Jerusalem. Anatolian cults persisted. Local traditions survived. So Persian kingship had to balance two things at once: a strong sacred identity at the center, and broad practical flexibility at the edges. That is not weakness. That is statecraft. And it may be one of the reasons the Achaemenid Empire endured as long as it did. Then came Xerxes. The name alone evokes grandeur, pride, war, and catastrophe. To the Greek imagination, Xerxes became the archetypal Persian monarch, vast, wealthy, powerful, and almost impossibly imperial. He is remembered above all for the great wars against Greece, for bridges over the Hellespont, for armies said to darken the land, for the battles of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. But behind the Greek drama, Xerxes also continued the sacred political language of Persian kingship. In inscriptions, he too invokes Ahura Mazda. He too presents kingship as divinely sanctioned. He too frames order as something to be defended. And in at least some evidence, Xerxes appears to have taken a stronger stance against certain diva cults, often interpreted as harmful or improper forms of worship. This is a highly debated area among scholars, and we must be careful not to overstate it, but it hints at something important. The relationship between Persian royal religion and older religious practices was not always passive or neutral. There were tensions. There were reforms. There were boundaries. There were moments when the royal center may have defined acceptable worship more sharply. This reminds us again that Persian religion was not frozen. It was alive, developing, negotiating with older traditions and imperial realities, and all of this unfolded in spaces of breathtaking beauty. Nowhere more than Persepolis. If there is one place where stone still whispers the religious imagination of imperial Persia, it is here. Persepolis was not merely a city. It was a statement. A ceremonial capital. A theater of kingship. A monumental vision of empire in architecture. Its stairways, reliefs, columns, halls, and terraces were designed to communicate order. Delegations from many nations are shown bringing tribute. Different peoples, different garments, different gifts, yet all moving toward the center, toward the king, toward the imperial heart. This is not just art. It is ideology in stone. The empire as harmony, diversity, ordered, multiplicity, gathered, difference, structured, and above it all, implicit or explicit in royal inscriptions and symbolic language, stands the divine order under which kingship is justified. Persepolis is what happens when architecture becomes theology. A palace complex, yes, but also a visual sermon. A declaration that the world can be brought into ordered relation under rightful rule. Of course, real history was never as perfect as the reliefs suggest. Empires are always messier than monuments. There were revolts. There were burdens. There was violence. There was ambition. There was human ego. And yet, the ideal still matters. Because the Persians did not imagine their empire as pure chaos imposed by force. They imagined it, at least in its highest self-understanding, as an ordered world defended under the favor of Ahura Mazda. That is why the Persian king could be more than a warlord. He could be a guardian. A steward of order. A chosen ruler under divine truth. But here is the question that hangs over all imperial religion: what happens when power believes it has heaven behind it? Sometimes it creates stability, sometimes it creates arrogance, sometimes both, and in the Persian story, both are true. Because the same empire that built roads, preserved local traditions, and created one of the most sophisticated governing systems of antiquity, also became entangled in overreach, war, court struggles, and the vulnerabilities that always come with greatness. No empire remains at its peak forever, and the more sacred it imagines itself to be, the more devastating its fall can feel. In the next part of our journey, we will follow that tension deeper. We will explore how Persian religion evolved after the glory of the Achaemenids, how the empire faced conquest under Alexander the Great, how fire and faith survived even when palaces burned, and how, centuries later, the religion of Ahura Mazda would rise again in renewed form under a new Iranian power, the Sasanian Empire. Because sometimes, a religion does not die when an empire falls. Sometimes, it waits in the ashes. There are nights in history when a single fire seems to consume more than wood and stone. A fire that appears to devour memory. A fire that seems to erase a world. A palace burns, columns crack, roofs collapse, treasures vanish into smoke, and those who watch believe they are seeing the end of a dynasty, the end of a city, the end of a civilization. But sometimes, what burns is not the soul. Sometimes what survives is harder to see. A prayer. A ritual. A sacred word. A memory carried by priests. A flame kept alive in hidden places. And that is where our story turns now, because the religion of ancient Persia, the faith centered on Ahura Mazda, the struggle between truth and falsehood, the sacred fire, the moral law of Asha, did not simply vanish when the great palaces fell. It endured. But first, it had to pass through catastrophe. To understand that catastrophe, we must meet the man whose shadow falls across nearly all of the ancient world, Alexander the Great. Some, he is a genius. Others, a destroyer. Many, both, born in Macedon, trained by war, driven by ambition, and fueled by a vision so vast it often seemed almost mythic. Alexander marched eastward with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. He defeated the armies of kings. He crossed impossible terrain. He shattered old political orders. And eventually, he came for Persia. By the time Alexander faced the Achaemenid Empire, that empire was still immense, still wealthy, still prestigious, but no longer at the peak of its strength. Its machinery remained powerful, yet it was strained. Court politics had weakened its center. Regional tensions had grown. The weight of scale, the same scale that once made Persia magnificent, also made it vulnerable. And at the heart of the empire stood its last great Achaemenid king, Darius III. He was not without courage. He was not without dignity. But he faced a storm unlike any ruler before him. Alexander defeated Persian forces in a series of decisive campaigns, including the great battles of Issus and Gaugamela. These were not merely military defeats. They were cracks in the architecture of a world. With each victory, Alexander was not just winning territory. He was unraveling an imperial order that had stood for generations. And then came the moment that history remembers with almost cinematic intensity: Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Achaemenid grandeur, the city of terraces, columns, reliefs, tribute bearers, and imperial symbolism. The stone expression of ordered empire, the place where power had been turned into architecture. Alexander entered it, and for a moment he stood inside the dream of Persian kingship. Imagine that. A foreign conqueror walking among the stairways where nations once brought tribute. A young king from the west stepping into the visual theology of empire. He saw the wealth, the scale, the splendor, and then it burned. The burning of Persepolis has echoed through history as one of antiquity's most haunting images. But why it burned, and what exactly happened, is still debated. Ancient sources do not all agree. Some later accounts describe it as a drunken act, a reckless decision made during a banquet, possibly encouraged by a Greek courtesan named Thais, as revenge for the Persian destruction of Greek temples during the earlier Greco-Persian Wars. Other interpretations suggest it may have been more deliberate, a symbolic political act, a message, a declaration that the old imperial center had fallen. Perhaps it was both, a moment of passion that also served strategy. History is often like that, messy, human, mythologized, but regardless of motive, the image remains unforgettable. The palace of kings in flames, the ceremonial capital of Persia lit by destruction, Achaemenid majesty collapsing into smoke. To later memory, this became more than a military event. It became almost apocalyptic, and for those who care about religion, the question is immediate. Did this mean the death of Persian sacred tradition? Did the fire at Persepolis extinguish the fire of Ahura Mazda? The answer is no, because the true heart of Persian religion was never only in palaces. That is one of the deepest lessons of this story. Empires build monuments. Faith builds memory. Empires store wealth. Faith stores words. Empires carve stone. Faith lives in ritual, in recitation, in community, in inherited practice. Alexander could burn a palace. He could not so easily burn an entire religious worldview. Still, the conquest changed everything. The old Achaemenid state was gone, its royal line shattered, its administrative order absorbed, its ceremonial centers broken or transformed, and with Alexander's conquests came something powerful and world-changing: Hellenistic culture. Greek language spread, Greek cities multiplied, Greek artistic styles, political ideas, and elite customs penetrated deep into lands once ruled by Persia. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured into successor kingdoms. In the Iranian world, the most important of these was the Seleucid Empire. This was a new age, not fully Persian, not fully Greek. A layered world of fusion, adaptation, resistance, and survival. For Persian religion, this period is difficult to reconstruct in perfect detail. Sources become thinner. Continuity becomes harder to trace cleanly. Many traditions that were once supported by imperial institutions had to survive in more fragmented conditions, and yet survive they did. This is where the story becomes subtle. Religions do not always disappear when political sponsorship collapses. Sometimes they become more local, more priestly, more regional, more dependent on oral tradition. Sometimes they retreat from imperial spectacle and become stronger in preservation. This may be exactly what happened in parts of the Iranian world. Zoroastrian traditions, whether already fully formed in the way later generations understood them or still developing through regional forms, continued through communities, priestly families, sacred practice, and inherited memory. The holy texts associated with the tradition, especially the Avesta, were not yet fixed in the neat, canonical form later ages would imagine. Some portions may have been preserved orally for long periods. Some may have been lost. Some may have been reshaped. Some may have survived in fragments. And this is one of the most haunting realities of ancient religion. We rarely receive the whole thing intact. We receive what history allowed to live. We inherit what war did not destroy. We read what memory did not forget. That means the Persian religion we know today, what we call Zoroastrianism, is both ancient and filtered. Ancient in origin, filtered by centuries of transmission, loss, reorganization, and reinterpretation. Then, after the Seleucids, another Iranian power rose, the Parthians. Mysterious to many modern people, often overshadowed by Alexander and Rome, the Parthians ruled a vast realm for centuries. They were formidable horse archers, shrewd rulers, and masters of balancing east and west. Under them, Iranian traditions continued to live, though the religious landscape remained complex and less centralized than it would later become. There was no single, all-controlling religious system in the later Sasanian sense, at least not in the same way. Regional cults, priestly practices, and inherited Iranian beliefs persisted in varied forms. But the great religious consolidation was still to come, and when it came, it would reshape the identity of Persia itself. Because in the 3rd century CE, a new dynasty emerged. One that looked backward to Achaemenid grandeur. Iranian kingship. Sacred legitimacy. The authority of Ahura Mazda. This was the Sasanian Empire. If the Achaemenids gave Persian religion imperial scale, the Sasanians gave it imperial definition. Under rulers like Ardashir I and Shapur I, Iranian kingship was reborn in explicitly powerful form. But this was not merely political revival. It was also religious revival and reorganization. The Sasanians elevated Zoroastrianism to a new level of state centrality. Priests gained greater authority. Sacred institutions were strengthened. Fire temples became more visibly important. The relationship between kingship and divine order was again emphasized with force and clarity. If Achaemenid Persia had ruled a pluralistic empire while invoking Ahura Mazda at the center, Sasanian Persia moved further toward making Zoroastrian identity a defining pillar of imperial order itself. This matters enormously, because much of what later generations understand as classical Zoroastrianism was shaped, codified, or systematized in this era. The religion that may once have existed in more fluid, regional, and evolving forms was increasingly organized. Texts were preserved and transmitted more intentionally. Priestly hierarchies became more structured. Doctrinal boundaries could become clearer. Ritual life became more formalized in the context of state power. This is where figures like Carter, the influential high priest, become important. Carter appears in inscriptions as a major religious authority, and his role reveals something crucial. Religion in Sasanian Iran was not merely personal belief. It was institutional. It was political. It was part of the machinery of empire. Once again, Persian kingship and Persian sacred order were deeply intertwined. The king was not just ruler. He was guardian of the faith. The empire was not just territory. It was a sacred civilization, and at its heart still burned the fire of Ahura Mazda, not as a literal god inside the flames, for that would misunderstand the symbolism, but as the divine source of truth, wisdom, and righteous order reflected through sacred ritual. By now, the struggle between Asha and Druj had become even more developed in religious imagination. Cosmic dualism became sharper in later Zoroastrian thought. The role of Ingram Manu, the destructive spirit, often understood as the great adversarial force, became more prominent in theological framing. Good and evil were no longer only moral abstractions in everyday life, they were embedded in a vast cosmic battle. Human beings were still participants. Every choice still mattered, every truthful act still mattered, every lie still mattered, every pure ritual, every ethical deed, every act of justice, all of it had cosmic significance. This is one reason Zoroastrianism remains so compelling even now. It does not ask humans to be passive. It does not say evil is an illusion to ignore. It says the world is contested, truth must be chosen, purity must be protected, order must be defended, and your actions matter. That is an extraordinarily powerful moral vision. But as always with imperial religion, there is a danger. When a faith becomes tied to the state, it can become strong. It can also become rigid. The Sasanians were heirs to a profound tradition, but they also lived in a world of competition, border wars, and religious rivalry. To the west stood Rome, and later the Byzantine Empire. To the east and south, shifting powers and trade networks. Within their own borders lived diverse peoples, including Christians, Jews, Manichaeans, and others. This meant Zoroastrian Persia was not isolated. It was engaged in a grand civilizational struggle, not only militarily, but spiritually and culturally, and in that struggle, religion could inspire or divide. It could preserve identity or harden boundaries. Yet for all the complexity, one truth remains undeniable. Persian religion did not die with the Achaemenids. It survived conquest. It survived cultural pressure. It survived political transformation. And under the Sasanians, it rose again with renewed strength. That is extraordinary. A palace burned. An empire fell. Dynasties vanished. But the sacred fire endured. And now, we stand near the final chapter of this long journey. Because even the Sasanian world, mighty, devout, disciplined, imperial, would one day face its own reckoning. A new force would emerge from Arabia. A new revelation. A new empire. A new religious age. And with it, the old religion of Persia would be transformed again, reduced, challenged, displaced, yet never entirely erased. In the final part of our story, we will explore how Zoroastrianism confronted the rise of Islam, how the old faith survived in smaller communities, how the Parsis carried it to India, and why, even now, the legacy of Ahura Mazda still flickers in the modern world, because some religions disappear into history, and some become embers that refuse to die. There comes a moment in the life of every empire when the walls still stand, the banners still fly, the rituals still continue, and yet the end has already begun, not because the people know it, not because the priests have fallen silent, not because the kings have surrendered, but because history has already shifted beneath their feet. A new force rises beyond the horizon. A new language begins to spread. A new faith enters the world, and suddenly, what once seemed eternal must fight simply to survive. For the religion of ancient Persia, that moment came in the 7th century CE. By then, the Sasanian Empire was still one of the great powers of the world. Its kings still claimed sacred legitimacy, its fire temples still burned, its priests still guarded ritual purity, its worldview, centered on Ahura Mazda, truth, order, and the cosmic struggle against evil, still shaped the spiritual imagination of Iran. But the empire was wounded. Years of brutal war with the Byzantine Empire had exhausted it. Treasuries had been drained, armies had been battered, the population had suffered, court politics had grown unstable, succession crises weakened the center. The machinery of power, once magnificent, had become fragile, and then, from Arabia, came something new, not merely an army. A revelation. A message. A civilization in motion. The rise of Islam transformed the history of the Near East with astonishing speed. Within a relatively short span of time, Arab Muslim forces defeated powers that had dominated the region for centuries. What had once seemed impossible became reality. And for Persia, the decisive turning points came in battles whose names still echo through history. Al-Qadisiyah, Nahawand. These were not simply military defeats. They were the breaking points of a world. The Sasanian state, already weakened, could not withstand the force of this transformation. Its armies collapsed. Its royal authority fragmented. Its last ruler, Yazdijerd III, became a symbol of a dying order, a king fleeing through the ruins of an empire that could no longer protect him. And with the fall of Sasanian political power, the old religious order of imperial Zoroastrian Persia entered a new and far more difficult age. Now we must be careful here. History is often oversimplified. People sometimes imagine that one empire falls, another rises, and instantly the old religion disappears. That is not what happened. Religions rarely vanish overnight. Civilizations do not erase themselves in a single generation. The transition from Zoroastrian imperial dominance to an Islamized Persian world was gradual, complex, uneven, and deeply human. For a time, Zoroastrian communities remained throughout Iran. Fire temples did not all disappear at once. Priestly families did not all vanish. Rituals continued. Memories endured. Sacred texts were preserved where they could be. But the balance of power had changed forever. Under Islamic rule, Zoroastrians became a religious minority. In many places, they were tolerated as a protected but subordinate community, part of the broader category of non-Muslim peoples living under Islamic governance. Yet that status came with pressure, social pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, sometimes legal restrictions, sometimes discrimination, sometimes periods of relative peace, sometimes periods of harsher hardship, and over generations many Persians converted to Islam. Some did so from conviction, some from practical necessity, some through gradual cultural integration, some because the world around them had changed so completely that the old order no longer held the same social force. This is one of the most profound transformations in world history. Because Persia did not merely get conquered. It was spiritually reconfigured. The land that had once given imperial form to the religion of Ahura Mazda would become one of the great centers of Islamic civilization. And what a transformation that was! The Persian language survived and flourished. Persian art survived and evolved. Persian administrative genius survived and shaped Islamic empires. Persian intellectual life survived, and helped build a new civilizational golden age. But the old state religion, the sacred order of imperial Zoroastrianism, lost its throne. And yet, this is not the end. Because some traditions, when pressed to the edge of history, do something extraordinary. They endure. Quietly. Stubbornly. Faithfully. In villages. In hidden communities. In the memory of families. In the recitation of prayers. In the tending of sacred fire. And for some, endurance meant something even more dramatic: departure. This is where we meet one of the most moving chapters in the story of Persian religion, the journey of the Parsis. According to later tradition, groups of Zoroastrians, facing increasing difficulty in Iran, left their ancestral homeland and traveled by sea to the western coast of India, whether every detail of the famous migration narratives is literally exact in the form later told is debated by historians. But the deeper truth remains: Zoroastrian communities did establish enduring life in India, and there they preserved one of the world's oldest continuous religious traditions against extraordinary odds. The name Parsi simply means Persian. And in that name lies a kind of beautiful sorrow. A people who carried their homeland in their identity, even after leaving in India, especially in regions like Gujarat, and later in cities such as Bombay, now Mumbai. The Parsis became a remarkable community, small in number, immense in influence. They preserved Zoroastrian rituals, maintained fire temples, protected priestly lineages, transmitted sacred prayers, guarded memory. But they also adapted. They became merchants, philanthropists, industrialists, thinkers, reformers, and bridge builders in a changing world. In time, the Parsi community would produce some of the most respected figures in South Asian history. This is one of the great ironies of civilization: a religion that lost an empire found longevity in diaspora, and meanwhile, in Iran itself, Zoroastrianism did not vanish either. Though reduced, often pressured, and sometimes marginalized, Zoroastrian communities survived in places such as Yazd and Kerman, preserving rituals and identity through centuries that could easily have erased them. Think about that. From the Bronze Age shadows of ancient Iranian belief, through the teachings associated with Zarathustra, through the Achaemenids, through the fall to Alexander, through Parthian complexity, through Sasanian grandeur, through Islamic conquest, through minority survival, the flame still lived, not always brightly, not always publicly, but it lived. And perhaps that is the most fitting symbol of all, because the sacred fire in Zoroastrian tradition was never merely about physical flame. It was about presence, purity, continuity, the visible sign of invisible truth. A flame can be reduced, shielded, hidden, carried in darkness, and still remain fire. Now let us return, at last, to the heart of the question that began this journey: what religion did the Persian Empire follow, and who was its chief god? The answer, now, feels deeper than it did at the beginning. The Persian world, especially in its most iconic imperial forms, became closely associated with what we call Zoroastrianism, or at the very least with the developing Iranian religious tradition that centered on Ahura Mazda as the supreme divine source of wisdom, truth, and righteous order. Ahura Mazda was not merely a war god, not merely a tribal patron, not simply one deity among many in the ordinary sense. He was understood as the wise Lord, the source of truth, the defender of Asha, the divine power aligned with order, justice, and light. He was the sacred center around which kings justified rule, priests preserved ritual, and believers framed the moral battle of existence. But if this story has taught us anything, it is that no religion lives only in doctrine. It lives in how people imagine the world. And the religion of ancient Persia imagined the world as a battlefield of meaning, truth or falsehood, purity or corruption, order or chaos, responsibility or surrender. It insisted that human beings matter, that every lie strengthens darkness, that every honest act strengthens order, that moral life is not passive, that the soul is not a spectator. That is one of the reasons this tradition feels so strangely modern, even now, and its legacy reaches far beyond its numbers today. Many scholars have long noted that Zoroastrian thought may have influenced the religious imagination of the wider Near East in profound ways. especially in concepts such as cosmic dualism, angels, demons, judgment after death, heaven and hell, resurrection, and the final triumph of good over evil. These ideas must always be handled carefully. History is rarely simple, and influence is often complex rather than direct. But there is no doubt that ancient Iranian religion mattered deeply. Its concepts moved through time. Its symbols entered memory. Its moral architecture left marks on civilizations far beyond Persia itself. And that is why the story of Ahura Mazda is not merely the story of an old god in a forgotten empire. It is the story of a vision. A vision in which the universe is not meaningless. In which truth is real. In which evil is dangerous but not ultimate. In which human beings are called to participate in the victory of what is right. And perhaps that is why the old Persian faith still fascinates us. Because beneath all the ruins, all the lost empires, all the broken palaces, all the faded inscriptions, it still asks a question that never grows old. Will you stand with truth? That question outlived kings. It outlived dynasties. It outlived conquest. It outlived fire. And in that sense, the religion of ancient Persia did not truly disappear. It became memory. It became inheritance. It became ember. And embers, if protected, can outlast the night. And so, the story of the Persian Empire's religion is not merely the story of temples, kings, or ancient rituals. It is the story of one of humanity's oldest and most powerful spiritual visions. A faith of fire, not because it worshipped flame, but because it believed truth must be kept alive. A faith of moral courage, because it taught that every human being stands in the struggle between order and chaos. A faith of endurance, because even when empires fell, the sacred memory survived. From the voice of Zarathustra, to the inscriptions of Darius, to the halls of Persepolis, to the ashes of conquest, to the fire temples of Iran, to the Parsis of India, the flame endured, and perhaps, in some quiet way, it still does. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten spiritual world of ancient Persia, please support the channel, subscribe to Relics of Time, leave a like if you want more deep historical storytelling. And in the comments tell me this: do you think Zoroastrianism shaped the religions that came after it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. And thank you for keeping history alive. Until next time, this has been Relics of Time.